What other reasons should we consider for looking at our cow-calf herd and trying to determine what's the best way to control parasites in them?
And this is where we've talked about strategic deworming, and that is the strategic use of an anthelmintic. This was developed originally in the United Kingdom, where they had a program called Treat and Move, where they would treat animals and move them to a clean pasture.
Okay.
Our goal is to try and take advantage and use an anthelmintic strategically, the best possible time.
Now let me back you up a little bit. What do you mean by a clean pasture? I mean, I look right out here this time of year, every pasture looks clean.
Well, and that's part of the program, is to find out when is the pasture burden the lowest. And what I mean by that is you have to think about parasite levels in cattle. And normally we think of most of the parasites are in the cow. Well, in fact, somewhere between 1% and 5% of all the parasites are on the cow. The rest are larvae on pasture waiting to infect cows.
So the majority of the parasite burden is the larvae on the pasture.
By far. So what we're looking for is to find when is that parasite burden on the pasture the lowest. And for us, that's when pasture starts to green up and we move everybody out. That's the strategic use, because that does two things. Number one, we take advantage of that low pasture burden, and we make sure that those cows that go out are parasite free, so they don't add any contamination to that pasture.
Okay. So the key is probably when the pasture starts to green up. It'd be a different
Exactly.
time in your country than it
Than
would
is
say
down
here
here.
in Texas and the southern states.
And then the next part of that is we look at moving another anthelmintic treatment sometime in the middle of the summer, when you start to see larval numbers and parasite numbers in the cows increase. And that becomes an issue as to handling. You know, most cattle producers don't want to bring everybody in the middle of the grazing season.
Yeah, and especially in this southern country where it could be pretty warm at that time of year too.
Right, and that stresses the cattle and you lose growth and productivity just running them through a chute.
Yep.
So then we look for potentially alternative ways to administer anthelmintics. Typically, most strategic deworming programs look at potentially using compounds 3 times a year. And the last one would then be at weaning. When you wean those calves, you want to make sure mama goes into that growing season parasite-free, her immune response is working better, she's got that calf growing in her,
Okay.
and we end up with a cow that's in a much better condition score. One of the things I didn't mention is with all of these studies, we've done condition scores. And invariably, the parasite-free animals are in a much better condition score, no matter where you look at it during that cycle.
So, we deworm the cows when the grass greens up in the spring. We come back in with a second treatment of dewormer sometime during the summer when the parasite load on the pasture would be low.
Right. Or starting to build.
Okay. And then we would deworm again at weaning, not just the calves, but the cows as well. So Dr. Newcomb, for the rancher that's running stocker cattle, talk to me about the economics. How's he get this to pay off for him?
Well, Ron, we did a trial in eastern Oklahoma with Safeguard, where we dewormed those cattle at day 0, 28, and 56. And from that deworming, what happened was there was a gain of 48 pounds. And the reason we got the gain was we not only got the worms out of the cattle, but we decreased that parasite load on the pasture. And those cattle were healthier going into the feed yard. In fact, it carried on to about a 28-pound advantage when they got through feeding those cattle.
So we deworm these cattle 3 times with Safeguard, and we got a 48-pound advantage during the stocker period, plus that advantage carried right on through the finishing period, and they were healthy as well?
That's right, Ron.
That's money in the bank, Dr. Newcomb.
You bet.
Now, Dr. Gasberry, the dewormers that we've been talking about to put into a strategic deworming program, we've relied on them for years. Are they still effective as they once were?
Well, in some cases they are, but I think we're beginning to see some changes in the worm populations that mean that producers need to be more careful now in what they're doing.
What would cause these dewormers not to be as effective as they once were?
Well, parasites, again, as I said earlier, have had tens of thousands of years of evolution and have found ways to adapt themselves to the host. One of the ways they've done that is to become extremely fertile. For example, a single barber pole worm can produce enough eggs in a single growing season of 8 months to have 1 egg for every person in the state of Texas.
And how many people are in the state of Texas?
24 million?
24 million eggs in 8 months.
Yes.
That's fertile.
But when you have that kind of fertility, it means that you also have a great change or a great opportunity for genetic change in a population. We think what's happening is that after 30 years of use of very effective and very safe drugs, we're using them very heavily, and as a result, we're allowing the parasite populations to change. So we're seeing changes in the types of parasites that are there, and we're also seeing changes in individual parasites where they seem to be becoming much more tolerant to the drugs or resistant to the drugs. And as a result, we're beginning to see, in certain cases, the appearance of populations of parasites that are not cleared by the use of drugs, where 20 years ago it would not have been an issue.